Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to explore a tool for communication that's, believe it or not, way more intuitive and deeply wired into our brains than written language itself. I'm talking about the simple symbol.
Okay, so let's just jump right in with a little challenge. Imagine you're about to teach a really important course. You've got all your materials ready, you know your subject inside and out, but there's one massive problem. Your students can't speak or read the language your notes are written in. So, what do?
Well, this wasn't a hypothetical for Dr. Samuel Law back in 2005. He found himself in this exact spot. He was in Cambodia, getting ready to teach preaching to a group of young lay preachers. He's got this 20-page handout all ready to go, and then, bam, he finds out most of the students can't even read English. Traditional teaching was out the window. It felt like an impossible hurdle.
So, what did he do? He did something absolutely brilliant. He just tossed his text-heavy notes. Instead, he distilled the entire course, the whole framework, into 5 simple symbols, and he put them all on a single bookmark that the students could just tuck right into their Bibles. Each little drawing represented a core pillar of what he was trying to teach.
And the result? Well, the local missionary who was there said it was like night and day. It was just astonishing. The students didn't just master the material. When he asked them to summarize the week, they could recall every single point perfectly just by looking at those symbols. And get this? Months later, that first group of students was using that exact same bookmark to teach the next group, and the course content was being passed on flawlessly.
A story like that really makes you think. It just perfectly illustrates a power we've pretty much forgotten in our world of text messages and emails. Which kind of begs the question, right? If symbols are this effective, why did we ever move away from them? Well, this brings us to a really interesting idea called the Gutenberg parenthesis.
See, before the printing press, communication was mostly oral and symbolic. It was, it engaged all your senses, and it was deeply communal. You did it together. But when print came along, it kicked off an era that put text on a pedestal. And this new way of communicating was totally different. It was linear, you had to read one word after another, and it was often a very solitary, isolating activity.
And the media theorist Walter J. Ong just nailed this. He pointed out that when a speaker talks to a group of people, they form a single, unified audience. But the second you hand that same group a document to read, that unity just shatters. Everybody retreats into their own private world. His whole point was this: spoken words and shared symbols, they create community, but print, it can actually pull it apart.
And look, the fallout from this shift was huge. We started valuing what you know way more than who you are becoming. Learning, and even faith itself, started to feel like this purely mental exercise. It created a kind of knowledge that the theologian J.I. Packer famously called 3,000 miles wide and half an inch deep. So, what was going on there? Why was that little bookmark in Cambodia so much more powerful than a 20-page document? Well, the answer isn't just about culture. It's actually about our brains. Let's take a look at the science of how symbols basically hack our brains.
See, unlike text, which kind of marches along in a straight line through the language parts of our brain, symbols, they set off fireworks everywhere. Our brains process them way faster. That's why traffic signs use symbols, not sentences. They light up our cognitive, our emotional, and our sensory regions all at the same time, which creates this much deeper, more memorable connection. This is especially true for huge, abstract ideas like love or justice, which are almost impossible to nail down with just words.
And this ties right back to that idea of community, of being relational. Neuroscience research shows that there's a really strong link between a young child's ability to use symbols and how well they develop social and emotional skills. In other words, understanding symbols is a building block for understanding other people and forming relationships.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. There's this amazing parallel to this whole words versus symbols thing popping up in a field you might not expect: artificial intelligence.
So, you've got 2 main ways to build an AI, right? On one side, there's deep learning, which is what powers things like ChatGPT. It's a brute force approach, sifting through these gigantic databases to find statistical connections. It's incredibly powerful, but it's basically just seeing all the individual trees. Then you have symbolic AI. It works differently, using logical rules and patterns. It's designed to be context-aware. It's designed to see the whole forest.
And what's so wild is that these 2 AI methods are almost a perfect mirror of 2 ancient ways we've always interpreted things. You have literal interpretation, which really focuses on the precise meaning of the words, the trees. That's a lot like deep learning. And then you have allegorical interpretation, which uses stories and symbols to find the bigger patterns, the forest. And that way of thinking is a lot like symbolic AI.
And you know, this forest-first way of thinking, it wasn't some weird, fringe idea. For centuries, it was a primary way that some of the most influential thinkers, from Augustine all the way back to the Apostle Paul himself, interpreted texts. It's what allowed them to find these universal patterns and truths that could bridge huge cultural gaps and make ancient stories feel relevant to totally new groups of people.
So, look, the big takeaway here isn't that we should ditch text and go back to symbols. It's not an either-or thing. The real goal is to find a balance, to become fluent again in the powerful, whole-brain language of symbols. And that brings us to a few questions that are probably worth thinking about. First, just think about the big symbols we see every day. You know, the Olympic rings are supposed to represent unity, the UN logo is about peace. But knowing what we know now about how symbols tap into our relational side, could we maybe redesign them to communicate their missions in a more emotional, more effective way?
And second, think about this. In our world today, which is so complex and changing so fast, we really need that forest thinking, right? That ability to be flexible and context-aware. So if we were to start re-engaging with these powerful old methods like allegorical interpretation, what kind of guardrails would we need to put in place to make sure that our search for deeper meaning stays grounded and true?
And finally, this brings it all back to you. Dr. Law used 5 little drawings to change lives in Cambodia. So what are the powerful symbols and stories from your own life, from your own culture? And how could you use them, not just to share information, but to really build relationships and communicate the truths that matter the most?